The boomer narrative about British values and integration just needs to die. It is coming undone at the seams under the weight of its own contradictions, and a growing awareness among the younger, my generation, that we are in the midst of an unwanted, unprecedented demographic experiment, thanks to mass migration and the multicultural management strategy, not at the start of it. And so, speaking as if millions of people from the third world who are neither inclined or, in fact, many are openly hostile to the prospect of becoming indistinguishable from the British host majority, if they even can, we are pessimistic about the prospect of that ever happening. And so when we hear the likes of Robert Toombs, the renowned historian who wrote The English and Their History, insist that being English is nothing to do with ancestry and is purely a product of values and feelings and education, we are insulted, we are frustrated, and we know that this lie cannot continue because it is endangering the very existence of our country. If you run Robert Toombs's premises out, if you continue this mass multicultural experiment, then you don't get the same country at the end of it. So Toombs wrote this article in the Telegraph following his appearance at the Now and England conference. We covered this before on the show a few weeks ago. However, the footage is finally available, and at the time, it wasn't, so I'm going to play and probably have to pause at various instances to avoid being copyright claimed on YouTube, but I'm going to play his response to a series of questions. There were two questions from some Zoomers. One was, how do we prevent sectarianism from hijacking individualistic liberal parliamentary democracy? The other was, how do we prevent this sectarianism being given fodder by sheer demographic volume? Even if we stop mass migration tomorrow, Mohammed is consecutively, for 2 years now, the number one baby name in England, and so this rising tide of political Islam is just an undeniable force that we're going to have to confront. And then from Carl Benjamin, if anyone can identify as an Englishman, why are we worried about this demographic change in the first place? And so Danny Kruger provided a response, recognizing that this is a hot topic for, as you can see, the largely younger crowd than the predominantly boomer panelists, other than Laura Brown, who was chairing, and Thomas Skinner, man of Bosch fame, on the end. But also, he said nothing about the demographic situation other than trying to ban things like postal voting as a kind of management strategy to curb the behavioural excesses of the people who are already here. Then Robert Toombs responded with this.
Well, I haven't got a lot to add to that because I agree with all that. I think I'd add abolish postal voting, if that can be done. Stop cousin marriage, probably. And somehow clone Catherine Burble Singh. Because if you've been to her school and you see little girls with headscarves on, reciting Kipling and singing the national anthem, you think that becoming English is actually quite possible if you want to do it, and if you're encouraged to do it, and indeed required to do it.
There was a lot of groaning from the audience that the microphones did not pick up at that point, including me shaking my head, because, as I've said in the past, the Michaela School is presented as a one-size-fits-all solution to the problem of having millions of first and second and even third generation immigrants in this country who were not wanted here by the population in the first place, who live in ethnic enclaves, who live in cultural silos, who hold deep moral and racial prejudices against the host population, and would like to see this country turned into the countries that they fled, despite having fled them in the first place. And so this idea that we can then become a sort of secular, liberal management state, that the state can take on the aspect of Catherine Burble Singh, can become a kind of headmistress to arbitrate these disputes between ethno-cultural groups, is undesirable because before mass migration, we had a low enforcement cost, high trust, spontaneous moral order culture that arose out of the natural inclinations of the Anglo-Saxons. You can see this in the German laws among the tribes, as documented by Tacitus, but also the long-standing Christianity that was made ergonomic to English instincts, that was practiced in this country even before we were an official kingdom of England, before we were a British Isles, before we were a United Kingdom, before we have become a UK, spelled Y-O-O-K-A-Y. So this is why the grumbling came from the audience, and the audience being young matters because we have only ever grown up post-1997. We've only ever known this dysfunctional multicultural Britain, and so we haven't had our experience of foreign nationals filtered through the kinds of limiting principles that the likes of Robert Toombs has, which is wealth, education, and sheer numbers. Instead, we have grown up around diversity, with capital D, and seen its undeniable deleterious effects in rising crime, in sectarian, ethno, and religious lobbying in our politics, in blatant and unpunished anti-white hatred directed at us, and us being sort of Nicholas 30, being forced to pay, using the largest tax burden since the Second World War, for social housing, benefits, translation services, language classes, job opportunities, you name it, for hostile foreign nationals, and we just don't like it. And so we are very pessimistic about the prospect of integration, and also, we weren't asked if we wanted to embark on this project of integration in the first place, so this is why the audience turns on Toombs here.
What's ridiculous?
Do you think you can teach someone English?
Yes, of course you can. That's how we all learn it.
To wait for the pub after to discuss if you can teach somebody English.
No, it's not.
I think this might be a discussion for after the conference.
So the chap in the front, it's hard to make out, but he said, being English is a matter of ancestry, and Robert Toombs says, of course it's not. So I took issue with this in a Critic piece that is hopefully going to turn into a debate between myself and these two figures in the thumbnail. We're still trying to set a date for that. But then it went quiet. This was back in June. It went quiet until Toombs the other day published the following piece in the Telegraph, where he doubles down on these comments and says, being English is not a matter of your ancestry. And I feel the need to cover this because in the second paragraph, he takes some not so thinly veiled and quite petty shots at me, frankly. Toombs, you're about 3 times my age and you're behaving like a schoolgirl, really. He says, this brief debate was unfortunately stopped by the chair so that we could go to the pub, but the day's discussion got huge numbers of viewers on YouTube, a longish report in The Spectator by Laurie Wastall, and a rather overwrought follow-up article in the Critic magazine accusing me, along with other self-identifying conservatives, such as Fraser Nelson and Neil Ferguson, of being a defender of multiculturalism and by implication of mass migration. Okay, yes. The reason is, as I quote in this piece here, Neil Ferguson, when making the case to me for Kemi Badenoch at ARC, after Kelly gave her maiden speech, her opening speech at ARC, he said that Kemi Badenoch and other ethnic minority and immigrant heritage politicians like her will make the case for integration to immigrants better than white men like us. And he said, by pure demographics, we're dying out anyway, so we're basically irrelevant. I disagree with that position. I think it's abhorrent. I think that we should be able to argue for our own nation on our own terms and not need to outsource the defense of our country to people who have regime-approved diversity body armor. And I don't think as well that, one, we will have the same country if we have immigrants arguing on our behalf to other immigrants, and two, I don't think it'll work anyway. I think most of these people they're not here for rational reasons. They're not here because of a deep love and reverence for the British host majority culture. Instead, they're either here for pure economic mercantilism, just extracting welfare and relatively prosperous job opportunities to where they come from, or they're here because, as many demented Islamists are, they're here for hijra, they're here for dawah, they're here to convert Britain into an Islamic country, and many of them are very open about this. Neither of those groups are going to assimilate, either because they're not thinking of our civilization in ideological or religious or cultural terms, or because they are thinking of it that way and they hate it and want to replace it with their own culture and their own Islamic faith. And so it is absurd to call oneself a conservative and to try to make this case, because you're not actually conserving anything. You're not conserving the people from which the culture, the history, the faith, and the feelings flow from, or are most intuitive. And the idea that Fraser Nelson is a conservative when he wants to treble the number of asylum applicants, when he said the Boris wave of post-Brexit migration was just an accident, not a conspiracy, when he celebrates the increase every year of Britain's population by 1% purely because of mass migration, because we have more deaths than we do births among the native population, as some sort of boon to our economy, never mind the fact that culture is being erased. And then he says, with a straight face and still insists, that Britain is undergoing an integration miracle despite being presented with the evidence of sectarian ethnopolitics, of the grooming gangs. He denies the rise in violent crime caused predominantly by migration in our major cities. So the idea that Fraser Nelson is a conservative is laughable, and so is the idea that Robert Toombs is a conservative. So Robert Toombs says, frankly, I thought this was laughable, and I've been joking with friends about being a lefty. I'm not saying that you are a leftist. I'm not saying that you yourself are going to take up a placard from the Socialist Workers' Party and demonstrate against the parents concerned about illegal migration outside a migrant hotel, Robert. What I am saying is you have the same liberal anthropology of leftists. You believe that people are blank slates. And this is something he says in here, actually. He says that all babies are born as blank slates. You believe that a man from Mogadishu can be plucked and taken to Manchester, and over a long enough time scale, with enough economic opportunities, with enough reading of Scruton and reciting of Kipling, he can become indistinguishably British. And that is simply not true. For reasons of kinship, ancestry, family formation, and heritage that you yourself have written about, and also Alan Macfarlane has written about in The Origins of English Individualism, which we'll get to in a bit. So he doubles down on his comments by saying, I should explain that my intellectual sins have been to praise Catherine Birbalsingh, invariably though inadequately described as Britain's strictest headmistress, and to have commented to see little girls in headscarves reciting Kipling and singing the national anthem showed that becoming English was possible on the condition that it was encouraged, taught, and indeed required. Okay, that's a category error. Englishness, Irishness, Scottishness, Welshness are ethnic identities. They are a distinct people. They are a chain of families, unbroken for over 1,000 years. Ed West, who spoke earlier in the day, his book Diversity Delusion, is very clear on this, that between 927 and 1927, the British people remained 90% the same genetic stock. So that means it was an unbroken chain of families left alone on our rainy little island to incubate a particular way of life, imparted from one generation to the next. In the great chain of civilization, as Edmund Burke would say, these little platoons that act as custodians for their culture. And if you are a conservative, Robert, you should know your Burke. The idea that within a generation, you can impart this culture, this heritage, this identity onto a wholly different people through a few years at the Michaela School is demented. It's not going to work. And the reason you got so much pushback is because we are in the midst of this experiment. The undesirable consequences that were voted against every time it was offered have made themselves manifest, and your proposed solution is not just inadequate, it is insulting, because it is saying that we must make concessions to our identity, we must define ourselves out of existence to accommodate people that don't like us very much. So it's not only not going to work, it is insulting. And it's a category error, because you are trying to, and he admits to doing this in here, redefine our settled, concrete identity to be one of a Scout's pledge of modish values that could be from anywhere, hypothetically. They could be one of many countries in Western Europe or the Anglosphere. What separates British identity in Robert Toombs' formulation from Canadian identity, for example? Because they're having the same problems, having imported thousands, millions even, of Indians in a recent amount of time, and therefore redefine their identity to be inclusive and post-national to accommodate them. What's the difference between distinct English identity, or even British identity to Robert Toombs, and all the identities of the Anglosphere that are experiencing the same problem right now? There isn't one. So you have a conceptual problem here, and as a renowned historian and an academic, who many respected before this, you need to iron that out. It's just lazy scholarship otherwise. He says, on the Catherine Birbalsingh thing, is this multiculturalism? I can't see how. Progressives reject this as monoculturalism, as it involves inculcating a common English culture. Poetry, certainly, and also Shakespeare, the classics, history, mathematics, science, and indeed as many as possible of the educational riches that those same progressives reject as colonialists. So a few problems here. Number one, you cannot learn an identity. You can't. This is Michael Oakeshott's distinction between technical and practical knowledge. Practical knowledge is gained, sort of wisdom, through experience, through being on hand. Technical knowledge is gained from a textbook or a manual. And Toombs is treating a sort of Michaela School approach to teaching a patriotic British curriculum as a blueprint for becoming that identity, rather than just learning to respect it and revere it. He's not just conflating the two, he has a profound inability to conceptually distinguish different types of knowledge. Like, for example, if I read about the Edo period, I wouldn't become Japanese. If I read the Torah, I would not become Jewish. If I read the Quran, I would not be, well, I might be considered one of the Ummah. Anyway, point being, I don't think that Toombs has properly distinguished these two problems. And the other thing, Robert, is that, yes, it is multiculturalism, because you fail to understand how you cannot layer a culture atop a deeply held religious conviction, as is demonstrated by the fact that these girls are wearing hijabs. The hijab is a symbol of a completely different, parallel, incompatible moral system in Britain. The hijab states that if women show their skin, if they dress immodestly by Muslim standards, they are to blame for sexual violence committed against them, because they have presented men with an occasion to sin. They have tempted them, and therefore it is not the men's obligation to control their urges, but rather the women's obligation to cover themselves up as to not to provoke the men. We do not think that way. As English common law has imparted onto women the ability to own property for centuries, we had marriages far later than the rest of the world. It's about 20 as an average in the medieval period. In the sort of 16th to 19th century, we had an age of 25, so we didn't have a lot of child marriage. We see women as capable moral agents. That does not mean that we are identical. It does not mean that we are equal in all capacities. It does mean, however, that we should be afforded the potential to exhibit equal moral dignity, and we should be afforded the same legal protections. Sharia law, for example, does not afford women the same legal protections. Her testimony is worth 1/3 of that of a man. So if she is sexually abused, 3 witnesses must attest to her chastity, otherwise she's punished with adultery. And that is often punished through stoning. And that was punished through stoning because Muhammad, when he moved from Mecca to Medina and was rejected by the Jewish tribes settled in Medina as being the next Messiah, they laughed him away as a very naughty boy, he brought back the penalty of stoning for apostasy and adultery. Very different to Christ saying, do not stone the adulteress, because only he who is without sin should cast the first stone. There's an old Catholic joke, by the way, that a rock comes hurling out of the crowd, hits the adulteress, strikes her dead, and Jesus turns around and says, thanks, mum. So, we have a very different moral conception to Muslims. And the idea that these girls, by reciting Rudyard Kipling, are suddenly transmogrified into British people who hold our customs and our Christian faith and our common law to be second nature to them, is itself laughable. It is wrong. And if you run this experiment, you're going to end up with a Muslim country anyway, Robert. This is why people rejected this. It is, you almost created like the avatar of what is not going to work. And just as a side point as well, to prove Robert's failure to distinguish between the concepts, Rudyard Kipling was born in India. Does that make him Indian? No. So, these Muslim girls being born in Britain does not make them British or English. They are of a different ethnic extraction. That does not mean we have to insult, deride, or morally condemn other ethnicities. I'm against ethnic bigotry on those lines. I judge people as individual moral actors. This is the great revolution of Christianity, that you are, as an individual, the locus of moral responsibility. However, does this mean that that is the case for every other ethnicity and culture and tribe? No. Most people place a lot more premium on collective responsibility. And if you fail to acknowledge that, we won't have a civilization. We will just have it hijacked by sectarian, ethno, and religious politics. Now, Robert continues, this is a completely separate issue from mass migration. Uncontrolled, non-selective, and far beyond rational limits, it becomes economically ruinous and socially divisive. It corrupts democracy, affronts sovereignty and law, and pulverizes national solidarity. I favor narrow limits and strict enforcement, but you don't, because you're willing to allow them to wear the hijab, which means that they still hold within their heart a religious prejudice that if practiced at the political level, with sufficient demographic volume lending it demographic support, it will disfigure this country beyond recognition. And if your only opposition to mass migration is the pace and the scale of change, then what you're proposing is, against the expressed wishes of the British public, rapid demographic change sufficiently managed by an authoritarian state. Because diversity requires dictatorship in order to work. If the Michaela School model is the way that you fight this sectarianism, then that is a strike against diversity, not in its favour, right? If it requires a centrally planned and strict model of governance, as compared to the relatively hands-off, parliamentary, sovereignty, limited monarchy that Britain had before mass migration, then that means that this is an undesirable project to embark on. And Toome says, the question of integration and eventual assimilation is no less urgent. Okay, they aren't integrating and assimilating. What now? Because you have no response to a what now. There are now, and in the future will be, many children in England who are born elsewhere or are descended from a foreign parent. Many will have skin darker than mine. We have a very clear choice. Either we do everything possible to make them and their eventual descendants part of our nation, or we treat them as perpetual outsiders, ethnic minorities in a tribalised England. That is a false dichotomy, total Hobson's choice. There is not the only choice of we redefine ourselves beyond reason to encompass our antonyms and to appease people who do not like our way of life as it stands, or we become the Nazis. That is a total false dichotomy, as usual, set up by civic nationalists to depict this sort of boogeyman of hard-bordered ethno-nationalism as the lingering enemy that must be defeated, and therefore to legitimize their own position. The third option is we assert our cultural identity without any confusion as to who the ethnic English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish people are. We can accommodate a small handful of outsiders who will marry into our tribe, who will engage in military service, who will adopt the religion of our state, who will forego their prior identities and loyalties if possible. But that number is so few that they're usually named in the history books. I use the example of Ayaan Hirsi Ali for this. Married herself to Neil Ferguson. However, the rest can go. They can live where they are more comfortable. If they would like to transfigure our culture, they can go elsewhere, and we do not have to be cruel or violent to do so, except to the criminals who should be forcibly deported. Instead, if people cannot support themselves financially, they should not be paid to stay. If they do not like our culture, they should be encouraged to leave and go somewhere else where they feel more at home. That is the third sensible and popular option that Robert Toombs is setting his face against. No, we should not redefine English identity out of existence in order to accommodate people who do not like us at all. And Toombs, as well, goes even further than most, because most people would say, okay, British identity is a legal and political identity, whereas the constituent nations of the British Isles, so Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, have ethnic identities. And by excluding someone from that ethnic identity, it does not mean that they cannot be British by passport, by citizenship, and it does not also mean that they are somehow morally inferior to us. It just means they have different parentage, different ancestry. It's just a statement of fact, just as it is to say men cannot identify as women or women cannot identify as men. However, Toombs says, I'm speaking of England and rather than Britain. Being British is primarily legal and political. Many newcomers are happy to be British, but we are also English or Welsh, Scottish, and Irish, and that is a deeper kind of belonging. The United Kingdom is technically a state nation. England is a culture nation based on shared history, customs, and emotions. Without these, the UK is an empty shell. Okay, that is just not true. It is not true that England is a purely cultural nation. Nations are collections of families. Larry Siedentop is very clear on this. The earliest nation-states of antiquity, like Greece and Rome, were founded on families who would gather together, pour libations and offerings out to their ancestors at the hearth, bury their ancestors in the soil. When they would go from one state to another, they would take some of that soil and plant it where they would move to in order to show that their ancestors had been carried with them. Often they would take relics from their previous cities. The best example of this is Constantinople, which hosted a relic from Troy that had also been hosted in Rome to show continuity between the civilizations. City-states, national identities are based on ancestry, heritage, parentage, family, and ethnicity. And yes, of course, religion, because the religion of the family became the religion of the city-state. And often when tribes intermarried and mixed, they would create new faiths, gods of shared heroes and myths and concepts. But this would all be rooted in the fact that the tribes had intermarried in the first place. And if you lost the religion of the state, you were rendered basically stateless. If you lost your state due to a sacking or a battle, you had been considered abandoned by your ancestors and the gods. All of this mythology, all of the spontaneous order that gives rise to nations and city-states is bound up in family. That is what our identity is based on. So no, it is not purely cultural. The culture is downstream from the people, hence the prefix British, English, Irish, Welsh, or Scottish before values, culture, and identity. It belongs to a definitive people, and those people are distinct from other peoples, like Hungarians, or the Japanese, or the Indians, or the Jews. Loads of these groups are distinct, and they are defined by their people. And Jewish identity is a perfect one for this, because just because they lost their state did not cease them to be a people. They were stateless, and that was a tragedy for them, so it would equally be a tragedy for the English to become stateless. But just because they lost their landmass, it did not cease their identity to be. Do you know who agrees with this? Funnily enough, it's Robert Toombs. So if you go to his book, The English and Their History, he defines the English in his introduction as the people who took the name English, set up an English kingdom, and subsequently named their country England, and those who have lived there after them and thought of themselves as members of an English nation, are in two ways products of history, because of what happened to them, and because of the constantly changing ways in which they remembered these experiences. This book explores these two connected themes. Though apparently simple terms, nation and memory raise questions that need to be considered briefly at the outset. What a nation really is has exercised thinkers over the last 2 centuries, whether nations are ancient or modern phenomena, whether they have some organic existence as cultural, genetic, or geographical entities, whether they are political and ideological fabrications, or indeed various mixtures of these. My view is that most nations and their shared identities are modern creations, the products of literacy, urbanization, and state-led cultural and political unification. So, he is saying that the nation-states itself are modern inventions. But we had the Kingdom of England over 1,000 years ago. And he, in his opening line, says, the people who took the name English. So that means the people precede the nation, a distinct group of people, of families, a tribe, who identify themselves as this people. And so membership of that people is conditional on a relationship with that tribe who owns the label. And so if those people, who historically have been very suspicious of foreigners, by the way, travellers from the Netherlands and Italy, in written correspondences back to their countries, have described a sort of suspicion and hostility to outsiders among the English for centuries. If those people have voted in every election and referendum since 1974 not to take in those millions of immigrants that you talk about, Robert, then that means that those immigrants, unless they have married into our tribe, are not afforded our identity. And so, no, you don't get to just carte blanche, rubber stamp them with the English identity because they meet your academic bar for integration and assimilation. Someone who's very good on this, by the way, is, of course, Alan McFarlane in The Origins of English Individualism, and I have his book here. But there's a very good passage about English identity that sums up most of his work. And it says that to survey the very whole considerable philosophical and travel literature of Europe bearing on this problem from the 13th to the 18th century is beyond the scope of this work. We will therefore single out a few notable accounts or statements, firstly by foreigners who wrote about England, and secondly by Englishmen who were comparing their own society with those around them. This is in the chapter defining the English character. Although they made comments on many differences of customs and manners, we will concentrate on half a dozen of the central features that we were probably connected directly to the pattern we have elaborated. The highly developed and individualistic market society was one which would lead to unusual affluence distributed widely over the population. It was a situation of very considerable social mobility based on wealth rather than blood, and with few strong and permanent barriers between occupational groups, town and country, and social strata. The strong sense of individualism was likely to be found embedded in the laws, in the concept of individual rights and independence and liberty of thought and religion. In conjunction, these characteristics would be likely to lead foreigners to think of the English as an arrogant and self-sufficient nation. Thus, we should expect foreign observers to notice that England was economically, socially, and ideologically very different from the rest of the continent, and for Englishmen comparing their own nations to others to feel the same. Point being, individualism is a form of English tribalism. So the individualism that Robert Toombs is preaching as being the cornerstone, the defining feature of being English, is putting the cart before the horse. Individualism is intuitive to, invented by the English people. So you need an English people to pre-exist the values that Robert Toombs is saying makes them members of the English people. He's got everything backwards. And this individualism is a product of England's specific family formation. This is, again, put in Alan McFarlane's work, which I encourage everyone to go and read. But because we had very low rates of cousin marriage, it was prohibited by the first Archbishop of Canterbury. It was then reinforced in the 13th century by the Catholic Church. It was only repealed by Henry VIII because he wanted to marry Jane Seymour, who I think was a cousin. But cousin marriage was never practiced among the majority British population. It was only a preoccupation of a few members of the royal family, like Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And so this broke up the clan structures that you would see in places like India, even China, the Middle East, and Africa, which made these societies very closed off, which had high rates of consanguinity, which had a downward pressure on their IQ, on their ability to have individualistic laws, on their ability to think outside asabaya in the Muslim world, clannish in-group loyalty, which meant that you only are honest and law-abiding insofar as it advantages yourself, your family, your clan, your religion, your ummah, sort of global Muslim race. The reason that England is so individualistic is because of its relatively nuclearized family structures, is because of its model of inheritance of property, where the first son might expect to inherit property from their father, but it was not in common law guaranteed. The father could actually sell his property. So property holders were individuals. They were not families. They were not collectives. They were not cooperatives, as was the case in Eastern Europe and in Russia, which is why actually the Soviet Union turning family members into informants mapped so quickly onto so many families, because in the peasant economies of Eastern Europe and Russia, if you didn't produce enough, then you could vote out the head of a household and replace them for the collective survival of the unit. England didn't have that structure. So all of these values that Robert Toombs is appealing to, encoded in our history, in our literature, in our laws, is a product of families, which means all of the individuals that participated in the building of England are named. They are people of history. They did specific things. They married specific people. They had children. They are a great unbroken chain, a continuity, a culture, a people, from who this identity flows, and it belongs to them and their descendants. It does not belong to anyone who arrives, who recites Kipling, and that Robert Toombs thinks they've ticked off all the requirements on the assimilation checklist. And this is why Toombs has gotten so much backlash from the likes of me, from the likes of Laurie Wastel, from the likes of David Shipley, from the crowd Now in England. It's because this is an insulting, anachronistic, ironically enough for a historian, redefinition of what our identity is. And so he goes through, but this is the part that I want to pick out specifically. Can you teach people to be English, of whatever flavour, or must it be inherited? I stick with my answer. We learn it. Every baby is born with a blank mind, even if its pedigree predates the conqueror. Not true. Not true. Your intelligence is inherited from your parents. Your political disposition is often genetic, as the work of Jonathan Haidt has showed. And if your civilization is based on centuries of cousin marriage, unlike England, you are less likely to be predisposed to individualism. You're more likely to have lower impulse control and higher in-group preference. And do you know who agrees with that? Robert Toombs, because that was his answer. He said ban cousin marriage. He knows this. So it's insane for him to say every baby is born with a blank mind. Unfortunately not. That doesn't mean we hold them accountable for the sins of their fathers. It doesn't mean that we inflict collective punishment on an entire people. But it does mean that we recognize we're not blank slates. We're not born free and equal. Liberalism is a myth. And that countries are made the way they are because of the people, the sort of collection of families over time, who make them that way. People create countries. Countries do not create peoples. Again, Tombs have it completely the wrong way round. So he says, English ancestry may mean that children learn Englishness at their mother's knee, or they may not. Many natives despise their English heritage, what the greatly missed philosopher Roger Scruton lamented as the repudiation of home. Yes, what Tombs carefully sidesteps here is also Roger Scruton's idea of a pre-political we. You cannot solve political questions if you do not define the community to whom these concerns relate and who are petitioning the state to have them redressed. And if you redefine our we to be literally anyone around the world because everyone is a blank slate and they just haven't arrived in Britain yet, then there is no cohesive community who can redress their grievances. Again, profound philosophical problems in Robert's argument that go unaddressed. And it's just not good enough because we are in the midst of an unwanted demographic experiment which has wreaked havoc on our country and disfigured our identity. And so we don't have time to play around with this optimistic narrative that everyone will just assimilate. He says, my heckler thought that Englishness cannot be taught, but it certainly can be untaught. Schools, universities, and cultural institutions across England, from the National Trust via the Museums Association to the Church of England, are busily undermining Englishness by propagating distorted and negative histories to make the native born ashamed and the newly arrived resentful. All entirely true. However, two things can be observed here. Firstly, as you can see in the communist countries, take Hungary for example, cultural and economic revolutions can be reversed. The love of country can be reawakened in a population which has been brainwashed to hate their own identity, their own history, and their own state. Christopher Lasch, in Culture of Narcissism, spoke about how the center of modern consumerist individualistic solipsism is not considering yourself a person of history, being ignorant of your own history, and therefore feeling no obligation to your ancestors. And it's actually that obligation to your specific ancestors which grounds you and gives you gratitude. All of that can be undone. People can be taught to have a love for the history that they feel belongs to them, the culture they feel belongs to them, the feelings which are most ergonomic to sit in their hearts. Yet again, that is much easier, actually possible, versus the impossibility, the Sisyphean feat of trying to install love for a totally different religion, history, culture, and heritage in a completely different people who have no connection to this land, who don't walk around its churchyards and think, I could well be related to these people. This is my country. And the other thing to observe is that you share the same anthropology as these revolutionaries, Robert. You, unlike all of the historians that you look up to, have this French revolutionary style belief that all men are infinitely malleable, that babies are born as blank slates, that with sufficient education, you can become perfected as an English person. And clearly you think English culture, quite rightly so, is the sort of peak of human civilization. So what you're proposing here is basically a utopian project. So when you laughed off the idea of you being a leftist, you share a lot of their politics, you just don't know it. And the final thing, I must say, other than just this sort of self-flagellating anti-white hatred comment, and who is in charge of all this? The English elite, the great majority, is pink-cheeked and blue-eyed as I am. That's not true. The Home Office is riddled with Islamic activists, for example. There are multiple Pakistani and foreign heritage politicians sitting in Parliament lobbying more about Gaza than Great Britain, who are obsessed with Islamic sectarian issues, and they have a lot more power than I or even you do, Robert. So no, a lot of this is actually just anti-white racism given political credence. But the final thing that I'll put is Tombs says, the conference I mentioned at the start of this article was organised by the Roger Scruton Foundation. Scruton saw England as its people's home, no more, no less. He wrote that while mass migration and multiculturalism have profoundly unsettled us, we can address the problem of social integration which is founded on national sovereignty and the sense of place. That might well be true when it's a handful of people, not when it's millions. He welcomed the outsider's desire to belong. If they don't desire to belong, what then? You don't have an answer. You aren't willing to tell them to go elsewhere. You just want to redefine our identity until they accept it, which means that we are erased. Anyway. And, Scruton, wrote that they could bring to their new home a sense of gratitude for having found it. I see that gratitude in Kemi Badenoch. She's married into the tribe, fair enough. Suella Braverman, fair enough. Priti Patel. Priti Patel is apparently indistinguishable from Edmund Burke, who I don't think Tombs actually understands, Benjamin Disraeli, and Winston Churchill. Priti Patel is the same as Winston Churchill. So if you didn't think that Tombs was credible already, this hammers it home. If lying about Brexit, if inflicting upon the population the largest wave of third world migration in history, against the advice of even the pro-migration Migration Advisory Committee, is an example of a sense of gratitude for having inherited English identity, Robert, then what does ingratitude look like? Who fails your integration test by this standard? If Priti Patel, who set up a Hindutva chapter in Britain, who said in Foreign Affairs Select Committee meetings that Indian diasporas are living bridges back to the motherland and asked for advice on how to leverage this for greater relationships with the Modi regime, basically turning the demographic that she allowed into the country into democratic pressure against the British state to favour India. If she counts as a prime example of gratitude for inheriting English identity, then who isn't English? The reason this divide is emerging among the older, established, self-identifying conservatives who themselves are liberals, like Robert Tombs, and the younger, slightly more reactionary, but certainly more socially conservative right-wingers, who, as Matt Goodwin described recently in Policy Exchange, prioritize cultural concerns about identity, immigration, and specifically Islam, over economic concerns, the sort of debates between Thatcherite capitalism and Soviet socialism and communism that were raging during the heyday that Tombs was involved in and paying attention to politics. The reason this has happened is because this is the most pressing concern for us. We have never known a Britain that has not been flooded by mass, largely hostile, especially costly migration. And so to insist that we just need to redefine our identity until it basically no longer exists to accommodate all these new arrivals that the population have wanted here in the first place is just not good enough. And this is why Tombs has had so much backlash. And I agree with him. Ancestry is not enough to define what being truly English is. You can be more or less English. I think Keir Starmer has English ancestry, but he's a traitor. However, you need to be on the spectrum itself to be considered English. And countries are rooted in chains of families, in ancestry, in ethnicity. That's not a moral condemnation of other peoples and other nations based on their ancestry, but it does mean that it exists. And denying this is not only an insult to the people who do owe their gratitude to their ancestors for building and maintaining this country, but it also puts us in the very dangerous position of believing a delusion, continuing this project of mass migration and multiculturalism, and walking down a demographic and cultural cul-de-sac that we cannot turn out of and expect to have the same country at the other end of it. So, frankly, just a terrible article by Tombs. And this boomer optimism about the prospect of integrating the overwhelming majority of immigrants here already or around the world, it just needs to go.